Times. Just last Sunday in the New York Times, Michelle Alexander had the opportunity to speak to the nation through that chronicle. And there, that word was sounded, that although there are some shifts and some reforms in the prison movement, it is not because the right wing is not moving their thinking about prisons because their heart has been changed, but because they want to save some money. That old saw. Today, as we invite to this dais Michelle Alexander and other thinkers and activists in this subject that so vexes our nation, how justice shall show up in our cities for those who are least privileged, and especially for the persons of color who have been ignored and damaged and set aside and slaved and Jim Crowed and now set again in a caste, a lowest caste. I ask that you who are attending open your eye, open your mind, that your ear be opened, and then that it not stop as a satisfying and important afternoon, but that it begin to be the ennobling of your will and the action of your muscles, your legs, your hands, your feet in bringing to our country a movement to abolish the evils that we deplore. I am thrilled that we have this panel here today, and I'm moved personally to meet Michelle Alexander today.
Annette is the Director of Education and Outreach at the Center for Constitutional Rights, an agency that is dedicated to advancing and protecting the rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Annette, Professor Alexander unapologetically indicts groups of stakeholders for their role, or lack thereof, in effectively addressing mass incarceration and in helping to build a movement, including highlighting the shortcomings of the legal and civil rights community. Given your experience working on issues of unlawful policing and prison conditions, what do you think the role of these organizations should be? How can they be more effective in helping to support and strengthen the movement? And how do you reconcile the often slow and deliberate pace of impact litigation with the urgency felt by the folks leading the grassroots component of the struggle?
I mentioned to Michelle when we were in the back that her book is so expansive that you run the risk of being duplicative, and saying something over and over again. I think one of the challenges for legal and civil rights organizations is to realize that they are not going to be the leaders of this movement or any other movement, nor should they be. I think it's a common conundrum for civil rights organizations. I think largely, given the history of Martin Luther King, and you had, the one leader paradigm, and you had the organizations that were behind it, but any meaningful movement is going to come from the people who are doing the work and who are being directly affected by, in this case, the issue of mass incarceration. So these organizations have to learn how to sometimes get out of the way. They have to come to grips with the fact that there is already leadership in these communities. And that leadership needs to be recognized, it needs to be respected, it needs to be supported, and we need to learn how to step back. We have had the pleasure at the Center for Constitutional Rights of having a legal director, Bill Quigley, who comes from a movement, radical lawyering-based background. And getting back to the center's roots of recognizing that movement support is a primary role of radical lawyering, is a key element in the effectiveness of these organizations. Training and providing opportunities for young lawyers and training them on what a radical lawyer really is. And what that means, and that it cannot be done from an office, that you have to get out there. You have to get off your butt and get out there and talk and listen and feel the pain. And the other thing that Michelle alluded to is the guilt and the shame. These organizations manifest that same guilt and that same shame. And people are not stupid. They feel it. They know it. I had the privilege of supporting the movement to have the prison telephone system in New York City, in New York State changed. It was a system that was a rip-off system that was charging the families of prisoners 600% more for collect calls. But I didn't lead that movement. It was getting over that guilt and that shame and having the courage of family members to come forth and say, yes, my husband is in prison. Yes, my son is in prison. Yes, my brother's in prison. Yes, my mother, my sister. We forget about the women in these situations as well. But the system depends on the guilt and the shame. And so legal and civil rights organizations also have to become more comfortable, as Michelle said, with the fact that all of the stories are not going to be the good stories. The good Negro, the good Muslim, the good immigrant, not wanting to deal with issues that deal with the LGBT community. People of color in the LGBT community are being targeted as well. So out of this, war on drugs, there's a larger war on people of color in every walk of life. And so I think, I know that the center sees its role as an organization that's primary purpose is to serve mass movements for social change.
So my next question goes to Major Neil Franklin. He's the Executive Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. He's a law enforcement veteran of the Maryland State Police Department and the Baltimore Police Department, where he worked for years in undercover narcotics as a narcotics agent and as a commander, where he also developed a critical opposition against our nation's war on drugs. Professor Alexander's book points out that the Supreme Court has given the police license to discriminate. Within my own family, my father was a police officer, and my older brother currently works at the Bureau of Prisons. As a law enforcement officer and a person of color, you're probably keenly aware that there are classes of people who look like you and I who have become part of America's middle class by reaping the benefits associated with playing a role in our well-oiled machine of over-policing and mass incarceration. However, your experience as a law enforcement officer has led to a vociferous opposition to our war on drugs, which you define as, quote, institutionalized racism. I think we can safely say that position makes you the exception to the rule as far as law enforcement is concerned. 2 questions. Has the disease of mass incarceration already consumed the Black community to the point where so many of us benefit from being a part of the system that we've become our own worst enemy? And 2, what do we replace the war on drugs with as a public safety solution to drug sale and use in the United States?
Well, first, the war on drugs has been extremely devastating to our communities of color. It is not the war on drugs. It has put police in a war against their people. My 30 some odd years of being in law enforcement, I obviously didn't always have the position that I have now of wanting to end the war on drugs. I used to be a police officer who was, well, how can I say this, very much ill-informed. Our training teaches us that people who use drugs are not really good people. Our training, our strategies, our tactics put us in communities of color. We focus on communities of color. Wow, you have to excuse me because when I go here, I think about all of those things that I've done throughout my years, and I'm sorry for getting off a little bit, but I think about all of those things that I've done throughout my years that I'm not proud of today. And let me say that there are many, many police officers out there that feel the same. Fortunately for me, I'm retired. I no longer carry that badge. Many of these officers are still in your communities and neighborhoods, and they feel this way about what they're charged with doing, the policies that are given to them to enforce, mainly in communities of color, not gated communities in the suburbs, and you know there's a reason for that. Of course you do. What our policies have done in putting us at war, not just police against citizens, but against each other. And Michelle spoke to that. We are at war against each other as our brothers and sisters attempt to come out of prison and become significant parts of community again. It's a very difficult path for them to travel. To begin the healing, we need to end the system that is mostly responsible for putting our people in prison.
That's right.
And that is the war on drugs. That is the war on our people. Thank you, Jesus. To do this, we will need your help. It has to be a movement. It has to be a movement of all the people, as Michelle said, not just the people within our communities. Our policymakers are not going to do it. They need to hear from you. You need to give them the reason to move. You have to communicate to them and give them the reason to move. Our drug policies have made our communities extremely violent. And I just need to talk about this because this is a specific dynamic between police and community. Police officers are afraid to police in violent communities. They don't know who to trust. And don't get me wrong, there are many police officers out there that shouldn't be wearing a badge or carrying a gun. I know that. But if we want to bring police and community back together again, not that they were ever together in the first place, but if we want to bring police and community together, we have to remove the most significant barrier in between the us and them mentality, and that is our drug policies. It is our drug policies that create the violence in our communities because our young people, unfortunately, the only way they know how to settle disputes in this illicit market is through guns and violence. Whether you're a user, whether you're a seller, we, the police, are charged with policing you and putting you in prison. We have to end that cycle. We have to cut it off. Our drug policies are responsible for thousands upon the overwhelming majority of people going into prison. And just like here in New York, I'll end with this real quick. Last year, over 50,000 people arrested for marijuana possession, just marijuana possession. 86% were people of color, 86%. And I'll talk more about some of those issues related to the dynamics between police and community, but I'm sorry I got a little bit off, but every time I go here, it just, when that is brought up, it just takes me back to those things that I did as a police officer for 3 decades that I'm not proud of, and that's what we need to change. I am a police officer in recovery from from police officer to peace officer.
Thank you. Our next panelist to speak is Sophia Elijah, who obviously has a fan club. Sophia is the newly appointed Executive Director of the Correctional Association of New York, an advocacy organization, a Harlem-based advocacy organization that strives to make the administration of justice in New York State more fair, efficient, and humane. Prior to that, she served as the Deputy Director of the Criminal Justice Institute at Harvard Law. Sophia, when I spent 7 years of my own life sticking up jewelry stores, I was admired by my peers in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. And it was a lot more fort back then, a lot less green. When I was finally incarcerated and sentenced to prison, my credibility amongst that same group was amplified. Given the lasting impact of slavery on the Black community, what do we foresee as the lasting impact of mass incarceration on the Black community, sociologically, psychologically, and economically? In short, how is the viability of the Black community affected by mass incarceration? And because we want to walk away from today's discussion with solutions, what concrete steps can be taken to undo this impact?
There are so many ways in which our communities are devastated by incarceration and the caging of human beings. The root problem is that as a society, we do not value our most precious resource, which is the human resource. And it doesn't matter how much melanin is in the skin of the human resource, all of us are to be valued. And that is the fundamental missing factor of the so-called departments of corrections across the country. When we criminalize people, when we cage people for months or decades, we distort forever their ability to see themselves and function, quote unquote, in the normal realm. When we send soldiers across the seas to battle and to fight in an unnatural situation, when they come back as veterans, we have the Bureau of Veterans Affairs to provide them with all kinds of counseling and rehabilitation to help them function as normal human beings. We don't do that for people who've been incarcerated. And as a result, when people come home, first of all, we've incarcerated people during their most vibrant years, their years of childbearing, their years of parenting, their years of helping to contribute to build their communities, to become homeowners, to become educated, to care for their parents, to run their community boards. All of the things that we look across the tracks and seeing people between the ages of 20 and 40 years of age doing, our communities, the people who would be doing that in our communities are wearing forest green uniforms upstate New York. So when they come home, their social skills are totally destroyed. If you cage somebody, and then we haven't even talked about isolation and torture and solitary confinement and putting people hundreds of miles away from their families so that they can't even embrace their loved ones, you have destroyed their very fabric and their ability to function. And as a result, the code of survival is only supported by being able to relate to people with a similar experience. And when you come out on the street on parole, it's a violation of parole for you to quote unquote associate with people who have a criminal background. So then you're left with no one. And the only place where you can associate with people with a criminal background is to go right back inside. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle, and we have to change it. What we're doing with people in quote-unquote departments of corrections is we're not preparing them to return to society. We're not giving them adequate educational opportunities. We're telling them that they are less than, all right? They are patrolled primarily, the people of color who are locked up in prisons upstate New York are being patrolled by people who don't look like them and have absolutely no common experience with them. If anybody doubts me, go to Attica, Auburn, Elmira, Woodburn, Shawangunk, Sullivan, and on and on and on. You'll see everybody wearing green uniforms who look like me, and everyone wearing blue uniforms not looking like me. So I don't know if I've gotten exactly to your question, Glenn, but I hope so.
I want to move on now to Gabriel Sayer, who's the New York State Director of the Drug Policy Alliance, and who has his own fan club also. Drug Policy Alliance brings together community organizing groups, advocates, service providers, and researchers to collaboratively advance drug policies which are guided by science, compassion, health, and human rights. Gabriel, as criminal justice advocates, we've all heard the rebuttal that if blacks stopped committing crime, they wouldn't get locked up so often. In fact, in recent studies, whites often considerably outnumber blacks in responding yes to questions that ask whether they believe that the criminal justice system is devoid of racism and treats people fairly. Yet, evidence has proven that at many critical points in the criminal justice system, racism and prejudice impact access to justice and affect outcomes. In an effort to go upstream and find out where the bodies are coming from, the Drug Policy Alliance has spent considerable time and resources addressing marijuana arrests in New York City. Tell the audience how that work relates to the broader movement to undo mass incarceration and the collateral consequences that flow from contact with the criminal justice system.
First, I just want to thank the committee of folks that worked on this, Jazz and others, because I know, having been on the email listserv, they put a lot of work into this, and so thank you to all of you who did this. Heeding Professor Alexander's call and talking about criminality, and your first question, Glenn, you're asking very good questions. I grew up in a poor rural community in California, in Northern California, and it took a long time for me to understand that but for the fact that I am a white man, I would be serving long term of incarceration. And the reason for that is that my own criminality, if I could say that it was just speeding above the speed limit, that may be great, but I participated in robberies, I participated in theft, I broke into people's homes and cars. I had a crew of folks that at a very young age, if we had been picked up by a seasoned organizer, we would have done just about anything. We targeted rich communities because we thought that was what we should be doing, but that didn't mean that what we were doing was right or just or that it was based on any fair analysis. But for the fact that I'm a white man, though, I'm sitting here today. And that is only because of the way that white privilege and racism works. And given that that is the case, I think that we can't understand what's going on in the US today or in New York City unless we talk about race and racism. And yet we're in a moment, particularly on the eve of a presidential election, where many of the groups, as Annette was speaking of, and many others, and certainly the political pundits and the political groups, are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on polling and on messaging. And there's a very strong push by liberal and progressive groups across this country telling us, those of us who care about these kinds of issues, to not talk about race. That doing so is not a winning message. We have to tangle with that because that's quite serious. If you look in New York City, last year, 50,000 arrests for marijuana possession. It's the #1 arrest in this city. 1 in 7 of every single arrest that happened in New York City is for possessing marijuana. 1 in 4 of every misdemeanors is marijuana possession. People, these are not small experiences that people have. They're handcuffed, put in a car, taken to the station. They're photographed, they're fingerprinted, they're put into the police databases. Many of them are spending 24 to 48 hours and sometimes longer in the city's holding cells. 86% of them, as Neil pointed out, are people of color. 70% are under 30 years old, 16 to 30. It doesn't have anything to do with who's smoking marijuana. It has everything to do with stop and frisk. 600,000 people stopped last year, over half of them frisked. I want to point something out because we never talk about this in New York, but the only legal criteria for a frisk is if they believe somebody's possessing a weapon. Now, New York law says something different, and the New York courts have ruled that the police can do this activity and it's legally justified. But that is the exact same thing that Bull Connor said in Montgomery, or in Birmingham rather, 50 years ago, and it's the same thing that the governors of Alabama and Mississippi said when the Freedom Riders went south. And we're at the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Riders now. They're not conducting legal stop and frisks here. And the idea that they're going to get out of being responsible for that by arguing that what they're doing is keeping the city safe is something that white liberals, particularly in this city, have bought into. Which is why white folks in particular, at every possible opportunity, need to be talking about race and racism, right? Not because it's just the right thing to do, and not because the racial disparities and the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration are so horrific, but because we're participating in something that is robbing us of our humanity. And so in New York, who is in prison and who is being detained and who is being arrested has absolutely nothing to do with crime. And in fact, we have one of the most high crime neighborhoods in the world in this city, and it's called Wall Street. And until Ray Kelly begins to police Wall Street, so long as Commissioner Kelly and Mayor Bloomberg and anybody else says that what they're doing is keeping this city safe, then our response, and this would be a reasoned, appropriate response, would be to simply say, "You are a liar." So I think in the city, we're all spending $75 million a year for these marijuana possession arrests, and I'm sure many of us would rather we spend money on things like summer youth employment programs. This is the thing that drives me the craziest, because they're cut $30 million from summer youth employment programs. They get over almost 200,000 applications. They take 50,000 of those. These are young people, most of them young people of color. They're going to cut those employment programs this summer, and they're going to ramp up marijuana arrests. So instead of people getting jobs, there's a very direct relationship here. So we have a huge task ahead of us, and these programs, and this one in particular here, I think is so necessary, because we need to get our heads clear with one another to walk out of this room and really get busy.
So I just learned that Gabriel's not black. Okay. Thank you, Gabriel. So I want to turn to Tina Reynolds. You know, I teach at Q. I want to say my name out loud and see what happens. I want to turn to Tina Reynolds. You know, I serve as an adjunct professor at CUNY, and when folks show up late for class, I tend to target them, right? So I'm going to target you a bit, and I'm going to ask you 2 questions. And I'll ask them together, but you can ask me to repeat it afterwards. Tina Reynolds is the co-founder and chair of Women on the Rise, Telling Her Story. WORTH is an association of currently and formerly incarcerated women who have been empowered by their own experiences while involved in the criminal justice system. 2 questions. Throughout history, successful movements toward social justice and racial equality have been largely led by those who are disproportionately impacted by the issue, bolstered by the support of sympathetic and more resourced members of society who are not as easily dismissed. Yet, in the movement to address mass incarceration and the role it plays as a surrogate for race-based discrimination, formerly incarcerated people have been repeatedly tokenized, largely marginalized, and often infantilized, even by our own allies in the struggle. Tell me, where in Professor Alexander's analysis and charge to create a movement lies the opportunity for folks like you and I to penetrate the fast-moving dialogue, insert our vision, assume the reins of leadership, and become empowered to unshackle ourselves and our peers? Second question. Bet you won't come late again. And if I can turn a critical lens on us for a moment, even among formerly incarcerated people who are working to impact change, there are different styles and approaches to the work, issues related to race, gender, and sexual preference, and some who have embraced the traditional approach to policy reform, and others who hold fast to non-traditional approaches to leadership and struggle. Some would even define this as a rift that has prevented us from coming together. How do we get beyond our own differences in approach to movement building and coalesce as a formidable and visionary voice?
Okay. You're going to have to repeat the first question.
I'll repeat the first question. It's feel like a game show. Tell me, where in Professor Alexander's analysis and charge to create a movement lies the opportunity for folks like you and I to penetrate the dialogue, insert our vision, assume the reins of leadership, and become empowered to unshackle ourselves and our peers?
Well, I'm going to follow up with what Gabriel is talking about. Race is a really hard conversation to have. And with our allies, we need to sit down and have that hard conversation. It cannot be a conversation where it's isolated amongst groups. It has to be a conversation where we're all together and we're hashing it out because we don't discuss it. And, you know, then too, I just recall a lengthy conversation Jazz and steering committee had in and around this particular issue and how we would address it. And even amongst ourselves, we gave great thought to how we would approach this conversation because we don't want to leave anyone out. We don't want to define you as we've been defined. We want you and everyone to join us. Just because we've had this experience, we don't feel that we should, let me just step back. We definitely should lead the way. We've had this experience. We should definitely take the lead. You can clap louder than that. It's important. I remember when I came home about 15 years ago, there were advocates that were doing this work on behalf of me. And Vivian, you can recall this. We were in prison and there were a lot of people doing this work on behalf of us. And we were brought into the circle. And there was a time in our conversations where we had admitted that they needed to let go. This was our issue, our experience. We came with an expertise. We came with a knowledge. We came with an understanding of what exactly we had experienced. And we came at it with a respect for those that stood for us. And so there is respect. And now it's about relationship. And being willing to have that conversation and that difficult conversation and not run out of the room. You know, so for us, getting back to our conversation Jazz and I had and a few other folks, the movement is a continuation of the civil rights struggle. It's unfinished business. Somewhere, yeah, that's what it is. Somewhere, we got lost. We forgot. We thought that things were better. They're not, as we can see. So we really need to get back to that movement, that initial movement, and the collectivity around that movement, and remind ourselves of how powerful that was, and begin to think about it, concretize our thoughts, bring every voice into the conversation, and figure out how we can do this. Because in numbers, that's the only way it can be done. Sometimes for us, getting back to that question you were asking, how we don't, as formerly incarcerated people, kind of like work together, I have my opinion about that.
Express it.
I think a lot of it has to do with the nonprofit industrial complex. I think that there is a lot going on where there's no solving the problem but putting a Band-Aid on it. I think that in those cases, because we as executive directors or chairs or grant writers, we're often pitted against each other in competition for that money. And then, too, we don't have that conversation. I'm one where I won't take anyone's money if I can't do what I want, because I know what needs to be done. But I get it, because our people need to eat, too. Our people need to be fed, need to pay their rent. But we have to come together as a collective and figure out how we can align ourselves with those that do give us the money or say that they want to give us the money, and have a conversation with them as well. You know, I just want to say this. I just completed a report where it's been identified there's over $300 billion that's given away each year. 1% goes to criminal justice. So where are we going to go? We're relying on the wrong people to end this.
Our last panelist is Glenn Ford, last but not least. Only because his name is Glenn, I didn't want to act like I was playing favoritism, so that's the only reason you're last. And he's the executive editor of the Black Agenda Report, a news website. He has his own blog. It's a news outlet. He's a veteran of television and broadcast radio. The Black Agenda Report defines itself on the website as news, analysis, and commentary from the black left. My question, when you and I spoke this week, you said that the Black Agenda Report's position, an admittedly left-leaning organization, has long been that the national policy of mass black incarceration is, quote, unquote, payback for the black freedom movement of the 60s. Similar to Professor Alexander, you specifically targeted the, quote, black leadership class, unquote, for its deliberate neglect of this issue, defining them as being more embarrassed than outraged by black mass incarceration. Given that position, do you also believe that the left bears some responsibility for the lack of a meaningful movement because of its line-in-the-sand approach to the struggle, which is sometimes unwilling to capitalize on the winds of change when it's not cloaked in racial or social justice and instead stoked by forces that have less resonance? It seems to me that the right, including conservative people of color who may not want to be painted with the criminal justice brush, if you will, are uncharacteristically ready to suddenly embrace change based on fiscal conservatism, and that the left is largely ignoring this opportunity and instead holding out for a social justice tipping point. Strategically, isn't it prudent for us to accept that while some tactics of the 60s movement may still be very applicable, if we're going to be successful in the age of soundbite messaging, partisan politics, shows like Lockup, and advanced technology, we may need to embrace an entirely new approach to influencing policymakers and affecting change? Or, as Professor Cornel West puts it, are we more invested in the value in the struggle? In short, what are the similarities and differences between the strategies we need for this movement versus the movement of the 60s? And are we squandering an opportunity for change by holding fast to what some may define as archaic principles?
Principles aren't archaic. Principles don't just get stale sitting on the shelf. People sometimes lose sight of their principles, and if we're going to discuss the left, I may have some difficulty because the left is very difficult to define or find these days. And that's because people are not moving according to principles that they used to have just yesterday. There seems to be, since the election of President Obama, since in fact his campaign became considered viable, a deafening silence in Black America, especially in left Black political circles, a fear of embarrassing the Black man in the White House. And so we have been paralyzed in our activity. Now, in terms of tactics and the need for new ones, we could talk about the need for new tactics, given that we have new technology, well, things have changed. But why did we abandon our old tactics, you see? It was not that organizing communities for self-benefit and defense was somehow didn't work anymore. We stopped doing it for a variety of reasons. A whole class of our people decided that the future looked very bright for them, that there was a future in electoral politics where there had not been for them, that there was a future in corporate America that had not existed for them before, but they could now access. And members of that class decided that it's not a good time to organize mass politics in Black America. It wasn't that that those tactics and strategies were obsolete. It was a class of our folk who abandoned the struggle for self-determination. So that's our problem, not a paucity of tactics, and not we don't have a problem with modernity either. And I think that the advent of Professor Alexander's book is absolutely right on time. We at Black Agenda Report were jubilant when it appeared, because it wasn't just an indictment of the perpetrators of this mass Black incarceration, this crime against a whole people, but also an indictment of those elements of Black leadership that were, as we discussed before, more embarrassed and ashamed than outraged at Black mass incarceration. Their failure to confront what we at Black Agenda Report believe is the biggest threat to Black community cohesion that we face. It is the biggest threat because it impacts on all the other areas of our life. It impacts on employment. It impacts on education. It impacts on our personal safety, and it especially impacts on our ability to organize. And if we can't organize, we can't improve our position in any of those areas. So Ms. Alexander's, Professor Alexander's courage in confronting our own political leadership was the element that it was necessary. And we are so thankful that she contributed that to the dialogue. So she gave us this book, and now we have to use it. That maybe goes directly to your question, or maybe indirectly to it. I'm going to make it go to your question. That is what follows from this indictment, not just of the people we know are guilty, but those who have not really represented our interests by failing. 40 years of failure to confront this mass Black incarceration phenomenon that now has created a situation in which 1 out of every 8 prisoners on planet Earth is an African American. That is an amazing story of failure, political failure. We need, in our evaluation of our politicians and also of every group that purports to represent Black interests, we need to apply a litmus test to them. If they do not put mass Black incarceration at the top priority of what they're going to do for us and with us, then they should not get our vote or our participation, our support. And finally, and of course we need a new leadership, but we have to understand that leadership comes out of struggle. That means that we need a movement. Most of the names and faces that we consider part of our traditional leadership actually came out of a real movement. We don't have that many new faces because we haven't had a movement in a very long time, so we haven't birthed any leaders. So that's how we solve this problem of an ineffective, 40 years of ineffective leadership, by creating a movement, and it will birth that leadership.
So now I'd like to open it up to the audience.
I'm Vivian Nixon, and I promise this is going to eventually be a question. You know, we've had this conversation where we clearly understand the connections and how the evil of systemic racism in the United States has morphed into different faces over time, from slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to the establishment of ghettos and into mass incarceration. My concern is that while all of these transitions were happening, while racism was changing its face, no one seemed to have seen it happen. And I'm a little concerned that there may be another iteration of that, even in our attempts to promote reforms. For instance, this whole movement for less incarceration and more addressing people in quote-unquote reentry. The whole reentry mania, to coin your phrase, Glenn, that has swept the country over the last few years may be another iteration of an attempt to classify people indefinitely or permanently. How do we avoid making the mistakes that we've made in the past and not seeing it coming when the face of racism has changed into some other institution, and are we at danger at reentry becoming one of those institutions?
I think the question is a very good one, and that we have got to pay very close attention to what kinds of new systems and tactics are emerging, you know, even as we have some prison downsizing, et cetera, that may in fact be the next generation of control beyond what we've had today. I think it can be very difficult to predict. You know, in the 1970s, no one predicted that anything like mass incarceration would be possible. People actually thought, mainstream criminologists actually thought prisons were going to fade away, because all the available research indicated that prisons actually created more crime than it solved. And, you know, mainstream criminologists thought that prisons would fade away. That no one imagined that 40 years later we'd have a quintupling of our prison population. But I think one way to, you know, identify or try to foresee is to see who's being targeted. Who's being targeted? And are there kind of divide and conquer tactics and politics emerging? Certainly the efforts to put tags on people and have surveillance in the community, which is less expensive than, you know, behind bars, is another generation of control that is viewed as less restrictive, because now you're not in a cage, but now you've got some kind of monitor or ankle bracelet follows you around, and people may feel more comfortable with that. And so you can see how, you know, support could build for persistent monitoring of a whole class of people with the use of technology. And so I do think we've got to keep our eyes open. And whenever we see a powerless group of people being targeted for some kind of system of control, we know it's time to stand up and speak out on their behalf.
My question is this, really simple. Yesterday I had the opportunity to accompany Tina Reynolds to Bayview Correctional Facility. And in that facility, we had like 30 to 40 young women that was in that facility that we was teaching. And over 68% of the women that was there were young women from the age of 18 to 25 that looked like me. So our young women that's going into prison is looking very young. So this question is for the women on this panel. It's how do we look at a generation that, when we accumulate the numbers of the years they've been incarcerated, was over 129 years. We lost a generation. So I need to know, how do we come out of that struggle to get our young women out of in prison?
The work that I do with women is really important. the education that we bring into the prison is an education that is experiential, and it's really important to bring education where you're considering the experiences of others. But it's so important to bring this education into the prison. And so what we found is that most of the sisters that we're working with don't know. They don't know that they're hurting. They don't know that there's another way. They don't know that knowledge can be gained while they're incarcerated. And that's one of the things that we're taking on. And that's really important because they will come home. And I really appreciate Vivian's question, because we cannot be blindsided. We cannot think just because people are being released that everything is okay. Our young people are in prison and they're not educated. They do not know, can I say this? They're asked from a hole in the ground. And we need to be responsible for them. We need to educate them.
A little bit of background about myself so you can understand the nature of my question. My name is Robert Lilly. I work at New York Youth at Risk Fatherhood Program. I went to Howard University. I was in law school, and in the middle of my law school career, I was arrested. I had a bunch of marijuana in the car. I was sentenced to 3 years. Had I not been stopped and illegally searched, that probably wouldn't have happened. So, but for me being black, that might have happened. Obviously, I made some bad choices. It was what it was. I got sentenced to 3 years. Luckily, I have a tremendous amount of support in my family and in this church. I was actually raised in Riverside Church, so I find it quite uncoincidental that I end up being here with you. The executive director at my company forwarded me a link. Up until a month ago, I had never even heard of you. I'm looking forward to buying your book and reading it. Anyway, let me get to my point. I'm sorry, I know we're limited to time. I had a bunch of people come together on my behalf. They wrote letters, including the prison ministry here, and that ultimately ended up in me being released way earlier. I got a reconsideration of hearing. So my question is, why aren't we doing that in more numbers? A lot of this mass incarceration comes in the courtroom. Annette spoke a little bit about radical lawyering. I want to know why we're not willing as a community to, I feel like what's been underemphasized is the fact that we're up against such big business and people are really invested in keeping us in jail. So what are we doing that's outside of the box, outside of the lines, and maybe even unscrupulous in ways? Like the same letters that I had written for me, I had a friend that was in need and going through something similar. I changed all the information on the letters and made them available to him because ultimately they helped in his cause and ultimately we're fighting against mass incarceration. So why aren't we willing to maybe show up in a courtroom for a stranger and so that a lawyer can turn around and say, look, all these people
Can I ask you
here.
just encapsulate it in one question at this point, please?
Sure. What are we willing to do outside of the box and be radical, and what can we do as a community to avoid this problem? And are we willing to take those risks and think outside of the box, even if it might look a little bit? I'm ready to cheat on our behalf, and I want to know if anybody else is willing to cheat.
I'll recommend another book to you. It's written by Paul Butler. It's called, well, I know the subtitle, A Hip-Hop Theory of Justice, with Let's Get Free, A Hip-Hop Theory of Justice. Paul Butler is a former assistant U.S. attorney, a former federal prosecutor, who came to very much regret what he did and his tactics as a prosecutor once he himself got arrested for a crime he didn't commit and found himself sitting in the same chair that he had defendants sitting in and saw cops lying on him, and he felt he probably may well have gone to jail if he wasn't able to hire the best attorney in Washington, D.C. to represent him. And he argues that we ought to get very creative about how we subvert the system. And he argues for people who are called for jury service, that instead of trying to avoid jury service, everybody should do everything they can to try to get on a jury. And when you're on a jury, you should vote to acquit in all nonviolent drug cases to ensure that no more people go to jail for these kinds of crimes. And he also argues that we should, encourage people not to snitch in cases that are nonviolent cases involving, minor drug offenses, and that these are forms of nonviolent resistance to a system that is destroying our communities. And so you may want to check out his book and read it. I have to say that I personally, while I would vote to acquit on a jury and not send, yet another young black man to prison for a minor drug offense, that I want to invest my time, energy, and resources in organizing our communities, in educating our communities, and raising consciousness and providing support for people who are coming home from prison. That to me, those are the strategies that will ultimately topple the system. And that, the other strategies are fine, and I'm not arguing with him about it. But really our energy has to be put into kind of this movement building work, not just saving one folk at a time.
My name is Victorio Reyes, and I'm with the New York State Prisoner Justice Network. If the criminal justice system currently is the new Jim Crow, then where is the back of the bus? And my opinion is that the courtroom is the lunch counter, but I would like to hear yours.
Where's the back of the bus? It's in prison, I think. I don't think it's not necessarily the case that we're going to be able to replicate every form of resistance that was used in prior struggles to the same effect. We're going to have to be creative and adapt our organizing strategies to the current period. But I don't think, many people think in this new era it's all about online organizing and Facebook and Twitter, and that's the wave of the new movement. And I do think technology can be harnessed to spread the word and raise consciousness and all of that. But I think we do need to get serious about protest politics. As we've seen in the Middle East, it makes a difference when people take to the streets. And we can't rule out old-time protest politics as a strategy for bringing this system down.
Thank you. Glenn, you want to add something?
Yeah,
briefly?
just a little bit. At Black Agenda Report, we're most concerned about the internal health of the black polity, about black politics. And we advocate that people follow folk around and harass them and denounce them if they are not serving the community. That is where there are politicians running for office. We should have flying squads that show up at all of their talks and rallies and demand to know their position on mass black incarceration. We should do the same thing with black organizations. Embarrassment and shame goes a long way with human beings. So we need to be embarrassing and shaming some people before getting rid of them.
So I'm being told that we have 10 minutes left. So there's no way we're going to get through both of these lines, unfortunately. But I'll just continue to take questions until we run out of time. So please be brief and succinct.
My name is Anna Maria Thomas. I come to you as a warrior in the classroom for 37 years in the New York City Department of Education. If we have 5-year-olds who are taken out of our classrooms in handcuffs, and as my noted professor said, the Middle East, let's get real. That didn't happen in the Middle East, not that it didn't happen, but our Egyptian sisters and brothers who are in Africa stood up. And we need to say, you talk about education, that's the kind of education we need to talk about, where we all came from, Africa with a K, because the alphabet never had a C. What do you feel about those young people who are being removed from the classroom in handcuffs? They're not waiting for our older sisters and brothers.
Communities should be able to dictate to police what policies they want enforced and how they want them enforced. Law enforcement are truly servants of the community. And it goes back to dictating this to your policymakers and holding them accountable. What this involves is a complete reformation of how we police, as I said before, from police officers to peace officer. And you have to be the ones to come together in your neighborhoods when something like that happens, and you have to get serious about it. You have to prevent this sort of thing from happening. You have to communicate that to your mayor, your governor, and to your policymakers, and you have to do it in a way. Glenn had a great idea. You have to embarrass people sometimes, and you just have to be creative. But when we change our policies that cause this type of action, that's the best way to do it. And that's when you can start building good relationships between community and police. And that's why I continue to go back to ending the war on drugs, because those policies are significant to how we police. It is the foundation for the bad police and community relations we have today. You know, when you talk to young people today and you ask them why police come into your communities, they say to search us, to search our cars, to search our homes. And they know we're in there primarily looking for drugs, and we don't properly address those crimes of violence against people, one person against another. We don't properly handle those cases of domestic violence. We don't properly handle those cases of rape because we are distracted as a law enforcement entity in this country. And we're distracted because of the bad, destructive policies involving drug enforcement in this country. Those policies have to go, and then we can work on those reasons why police should be in those communities. And I'll close with this. The way it should be is that when a police officer is walking down the street in your community, any citizen, any person, no matter how old, no matter how young, whatever their issue is, should be able to approach that police officer and ask that police officer for assistance and get it. Period.
I just wanted to add that I know that what's missing, and I didn't have a chance to really talk about, which many of you are aware of and live with every day, the larger problem we have in New York City regarding stops and frisks by the New York Police Department. And the fact that they stopped almost 600,000 people last year, 81% of them Black and Latino. But what allows this to continue is that there is no accountability and there's no transparency. And a lot of these, it's happening in the schools. There are vertical sweeps that occur in the housing projects. People that live in the housing projects are being cited for loitering in front of their own buildings. You look at certain precincts in Brooklyn, in Bushwick, in Bushwick, where, you know, the stop and frisk numbers, whole communities are under siege. And so one of the ways in which organizations can be helpful in responding to what the community needs is getting information. It goes back to what Gabriel said about education, knowing what the data is, knowing these are the tools that communities need in order to be better informed and organized amongst themselves.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes left, folks. Question here on my right.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Professor, for writing such a wonderful book. I read your book 6 months ago while a prisoner at the Auburn Correctional Facility. And I made it my business to pass that book on to others because, as the sister said, that guys don't know their butt from the hole in the wall. That is most true. And when I asked them, what do you think about the book? The shock in their face at what's really going on and what they're caught up in, it's obvious, you know. And I just came out Monday, and here I am today, and 21 years in prison, so, you know. And thank you. Keep up the fight, all of you.
Thank you. Welcome home.
Do I have time? Hi, I want to thank you all for this panel. And Gabriel, I want to thank you for bringing out the discussion about your white skin and your white skin privilege, because often this conversation gets placed on the shoulders and the backs of people of color and communities of color. I'm part of a group called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and we talk about, the need for a common language around race, racism, and white privilege. And we also talk about grassroots community organizing, which is essential to any movement. So what can people in this audience do other than attending the Undoing Racism workshop? What can people do leaving this building in their white communities and in their communities of color to join this movement or to support this movement? Concrete things when we leave here today.
That's a great question. Anyone?
I can say there's a couple of things. I work at the Drug Policy Alliance, and we partner with Voices of Community Advocates and Leaders Vocal, and another group, ISRA, the Institute for Juvenile Justice Reform and Alternatives. We're conducting Know Your Rights trainings in the city, as many others do, CCR, NYCLU. If you have not been through one, I strongly advise you to go to one. It will not stop you from getting arrested or harassed by the police, but it will help you navigate that situation in such a way that you can hopefully get out of it without getting harmed. Okay. If you do get picked up, you can do something about it, potentially even a civil suit and sue them. But it also connects you with folks in this city who are focused on those kinds of activities. On Thursday, this coming Thursday at 1 p.m., there's a rally at City Hall about the racist, costly, and illegal marijuana arrests here in this city. It's got a lot of elected officials, a lot of community groups are coming, so we welcome you to come and join us. And then one other thing I would say is just go to any of the websites of the groups that are here. I mean, all of our organizations are listed in the bios, and all of us have a lot going on, probably more so than could even fit into an entire week. And getting involved in that way is, I think, a constructive method.
Thank you. A round of applause for the panel, please. Another round of applause for Professor Alexander. And a round of applause for yourselves for showing up here today to be part of the movement.